Well, guys, I messed up. Alright everyone, welcome back to another video on the channel. This episode we're going to focus on the Sega Dreamcast, specifically some of the mods that are going to allow us to ease this 20-year-old console into the 21st century. Now before I begin, I will go ahead and give you forewarning, this is not going to be an in-depth video where I talk a lot about each individual mod, or go ahead and give you an in-depth look, almost like it's a how-to video. It's going to be a mishmash of kind of everything, like most of my videos are, so if you really want to do some of these things, I highly suggest you go ahead and do some of your own research. And if you've got any questions, feel free to go ahead and leave me a comment. I'll do my best to either provide you with a resource to go ahead and answer your question or answer it myself. Now you're probably wondering, what mods can you even do for the Sega Dreamcast? And you'd be surprised that the answer is actually quite a few. Now I'm not going to do all of them here today, but I am going to do a few that are going to act as quality of life mods, so when I do want to go ahead and I want to play the Dreamcast, things are a little bit easier. The first thing I'm going to focus on, okay, is replacing the aged optical drive with a modern equivalent, okay, and it's going to be using this board here, okay, and it's called a GDMU. The GDMU stands for Gigabyte Drive Emulation. And so inside the Dreamcast is a GD-ROM. And so you've probably heard of CD-ROM, DVD-ROM, and now you're hearing GD-ROM, and you're probably wondering what's that. Now, deductive reasoning would tell you the G stands for gigabyte, and what you've got here is an optical device that is capable of handling a disk that could be 1 to 1.1 gigabytes in size. They went with their own design with the GD-ROM because they didn't want to license the DVD-ROM tech from Sony and their other partners, I think like Philips and whatever. The GD-ROM is actually a pretty interesting piece of technology, but it hasn't aged very well. First and foremost, these things are obnoxiously loud. And they're also prone to failure. Now, I'm not going to lie that the first one, the sound thing, is a universal thing. Everyone agrees that they're obnoxious. But the failure part is hit or miss depending on who you talk to. Personally, I've had 3 Dreamcasts, and not a single GD-ROM has failed. They've been good at going ahead and playing regular games. They've been good at playing multi-disc games. They've been good at playing scratch discs. They've been good at playing pirated discs. And yes, pirated discs were a huge problem with the Dreamcast. That's another argument in the Dreamcast community. Was piracy the reason the Dreamcast failed? It was part of it, but the Dreamcast, because it used the GD-ROM, they thought that piracy, was something that was not going to happen right away. The situation is that it was very easy to go ahead and compress certain data on the disk in order to go ahead and meet CD-ROM size specs, which is anywhere from 750 megabytes to approximately 850 megabytes. And so with a little bit of work, you could go ahead and you could make a Dreamcast play a burnt copy of a disc on a regular CDR. Now, there are some downsides to the GDMU. They are not 100% compatible with every game. Nothing matters to me that they're not. But it also goes ahead and it pulls out, the actual GD-ROM. And so my GD-ROM is still functional. It sucks because I do have some real games. I have some good ones like Crazy Taxi and even Skies of Arcadia that I'm going to have to just play as an image. It's not a big deal. Okay, it's just that physical media that I now have has to sit in the shelf and go ahead and gather dust. Now, in order, for the GDMU to go ahead and look like it belongs there, you'll notice, that I have these 2 3D printed trays. Now, I went with silver because I thought this actually matched the gray color of the Dreamcast pretty well, but it's also because I didn't have black at the time. I actually think the silver will actually be pretty nice considering that the GDMU is black. I think it'll be a good little accent change. We'll find out. I can always reprint others. Now, other than aesthetics, these trays are also meant to go ahead and divert airflow around the GDMU that doesn't get really hot in order to keep the power supply cool. That's another part of this mod. With the GDMU, you're pulling out the GD-ROM, which uses the 12-volt rail of the power supply. The power supply in the Dreamcast is very similar to your just modern power supply you find in a computer. It's got a 12-volt rail, it's got a 5-volt rail, and it's got a 3.3-volt rail. The 12-volt rail is only used to power the GD-ROM and then the accessories like the broadband adapter or the 56K modem. All right, so we're going to take a brief time out, and we're going to talk about the internet connectivity that the Dreamcast had. I've talked about this just privately about how enamored I have been with Sega. Now, I admitted in my last video, okay, that the Sega Genesis was the first 16-bit console I had, and it was interesting because the console wars during the 16-bit era was just so fascinating. You had the Sega Genesis, which actually originally came out in 1989, which was supposed to compete with the regular Nintendo, the NES, which was only 8-bit. But you have to remember that Nintendo had, it was like something obnoxious, like almost 90% of the market share at the time, and Sega was trying to find a way to go ahead and compete.
Genesis does
16-bit arcade graphics.
You can't do this on Nintendo. Genesis does
16-bit sports action.
You can't do this on Nintendo. Genesis
Does.
Genesis
Does.
Genesis
Does.
Genesis
Does.
Genesis does.
Get Joe Montana free, Pat Riley free, Buster Douglas free, Super Monaco GP free, or Collins free.
Genesis does.
What Nintendo?
Now, other than that just cheesy commercial, what's so neat was that Sega pushed the boundaries of technology. And so it started out in the 90s with the Sega Channel. And the Sega Channel, for all intents and purposes, you should really credit with the exponential growth of broadband internet. And so what we end up having is that the Sega Channel was nothing more than basically a miniature cable modem as a cartridge, okay, with RAM. And what happened is you could go ahead, you plug that in, you would log in, and you could download games, okay, whether it was expansions, okay, or whether it was full-fledged games on the Sega Genesis. Now, this was happening in Japan via the Satellaview for the Super Nintendo, but it was the first time in this country that we ever saw something like that. The situation was is that in order for it to work is that the cable companies across the country, because it was such a great moneymaker, they charged like back in 1994 or 1995 like $15.99 a month, which was quite a lot of money for a small service back then. But in order for them to go ahead and actually make it work, they needed to actually update all the infrastructure around their cable technology. And so that helped pave the way for broadband internet, even though the Sega Channel really was a really small market. We really have to hand it to Sega for actually pushing the technology through to the Dreamcast in order to go ahead and make online console gaming a reality. Now, if you even think about the current generation, okay, even the Switch, and part of that's Nintendo's fault, struggles to actually make it easy to go ahead and play people online. But online console gaming at the time was unheard of. And in fact, in that same generation, which included the Dreamcast, the PlayStation 2, the GameCube, and the Xbox, it wasn't until the Xbox, which some people will go ahead and say is nothing more than the Dreamcast 2. It took Microsoft until 2002 for Xbox Live to even become a thing. Sega had the forethought to think that this was going to be an important part of console gaming in 1999. And 3 years of time and technology is a lot. And it's one of those things where I just find it so interesting that Sega was always ahead of the curve when it came with technology. Unfortunately, sometimes a little too much, and it just never seemed to pan out for them when it came to console gaming. Arcade gaming, a little bit different. All right, but we're talking about the Dreamcast, so we won't go there right now. Because I'm going to pull the GDMU out and I don't have any plans on actually going ahead and using the 56K modem or the broadband adapter, I'm going to go ahead and desolder the 12-volt rail. Some people say that it's not necessary. Some people say that if you just divert cooling, it's good enough. But honestly, okay, enough people have told me, hey, it's a good mod, just do it. It's so easy to desolder it. It's 3 legs, boom, it's out, and I can just put it in a safe place. All right, and then if I ever need it back in for whatever reason, I just can go ahead and solder it back in. Now, as far as cooling is concerned, we are going to go ahead and update the cooling system as well. There are a couple different revisions of the Dreamcast. There's revision 0, which is obviously the first version. There's revision 1, which is the second version. And then there's revision 2. Revision 2, for the most part, is hit or miss whether it plays bootleg games. Revision 1 is pretty much compatible with any mod you can think of, especially the ones I'm talking about here, and that's what I have. And then from there, okay, revision 0, that is the first gen, and so cooling is a little different there. They use heat pipes, very similar to what you see in a laptop, and it's got an all-metal fan assembly. This is plastic and uses this tiny little fan. And so what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and replace that loud monstrosity that doesn't move as much air, okay, with a Noctua fan. And so this is just a 40 millimeter Noctua fan. And so this goes ahead and this sits, okay, inside of this little 3D printed shroud. We can go ahead and screw it in with a small little M4 screw. And this just plops down and replaces the original fan. Now, as far as I remember, I do have to go ahead and do some soldering in order to go ahead and make this fan work. Not that big of a deal, but that's going to go ahead and provide us more airflow with less sound, which should also help the heat issue as well. All right, so some other mods we're going to work on, okay, just kind of wrapping things up. I talked about it in my last video, but so this thing has a clock battery, which is similar to a CMOS battery in a computer. The difference is that it uses a rechargeable lithium-ion coin cell. You can't just replace it with a regular CR2032 battery because it recharges. So I had to buy a rechargeable lithium cell, which cost me a couple more dollars, but they're soldered into place. So what you can do is you can desolder them, and you can go ahead and put an actual holder in its place, and that's what's in this bag here, along with this coin cell. That's going to be a pretty easy mod, so I'm excited about doing that. And that way in the future, if the battery dies again, I just easily replace it. The last thing we're going to work on, and say it's this small little bag here, these are resettable fuses. The Maple Bus, which is in charge of all of the controller communications for the Dreamcast, is actually derived from hardware from Arcade Tech. And so, now the last mod that we're going to do, okay, is going to be right here, and so it's these little things. Now, all these are just small resettable fuses. The Dreamcast hardware uses what's called the Maple Bus, which is what controls all the hardware side communications for the controller. The Maple Bus, from my understanding, is derived from hardware tech, and because of that, hot swapping is a little iffy. Hot swapping, again, is when you plug and unplug your controller, okay, when the console is on. Now, the reason for that is because, remember, the Dreamcast controller doesn't just have the ability to plug in memory cards and go ahead and plug in rumble packs. It also has the VMUs, which are their own tiny, tiny little computer in of itself. And so if they get a big voltage spike, instead of ruining something like the VMU or something on the Maple Bus itself, it goes ahead and blows a fuse. Now the fuses are just old school fuses, and they have to be replaced. And so with the resettable fuse, you can go ahead, turn the console off, the fuse resets, and then turn the console back on, and now you don't have to do anything. My Dreamcast doesn't have any broken controller ports as far as I'm aware of, so for me it hasn't been an issue. It's never been an issue for all intents and purposes for me for any of my Dreamcast, but it was easy, and those were like $4. So it wasn't that big of a deal for me to do it if I'm already going to be in there. That's about it. Okay, so those are the mods. Now that I've gone through them, like I said, you can go ahead and check the description for links of all these things if you want to go ahead and mod a Dreamcast yourself. But we're going to go ahead, we're going to start working on actually opening this thing up and modding the console. Alright, so the first thing we're going to do is we have to remove the top case. And to do that, there's actually just 4 Phillips screws on the bottom, but before we do that, they say, at least all the guides I've read, is to pull or watched, pull the 56K modem off. So we did that. That can just go aside. Then from there, we get these 4 Phillips screws out. We go ahead and grab my iFixit kit and a little screwdriver and go ahead and pull these guys out. Now, if you ever are working on stuff like this, I highly suggest having a good little toolkit. This one from iFixit, my wife got me for Christmas one year. It's actually relatively cheap. It's a nice magnetized tip, so if you do need to go ahead and pull things out or put it in, it does stick like that. Also, make sure you have something to put your screws in, okay, as you go ahead and you pull stuff apart. So I'm just going to go ahead and unscrew this and alright, and then inside exposed, okay, you can see the Dreamcast. So here's our GD-ROM unit, and this comes out with a couple screws. This is our power supply. On here are 12-volt rail Ooh, this looks different than what I've seen, so I'm going to have to actually figure out where I'm pulling the 12-volt rail out of there. So I'll figure that out momentarily. And then you can see here, all right, that's the battery that's going bad, so we desolder that and we put the new one in. We're going to start off with just with the GDMU stuff, so that's not going to be that big of a deal. You know, and then from there we'll go ahead and we'll kind of work through the rest of it. So let's work on getting this GDMU out. Okay, and like that, GD-ROM assembly is out, and it came out pretty easy. What's interesting is the actual optical drive unit pops out of here, which I have to just pop back in place for the time being and hope that it stays there. It seems like that's actually meant to be that way. That's intriguing. Okay, so that's gone. Now, you can see once this is gone, when this was here, so if I just go ahead and I pop this back in, just kind of in place. So you can see, all right, this is your fan, and then airflow went this way to the power supply. And so now with this gone, if you were to just leave that open, air would just kind of just gather underneath the GDMU and never get there. And so the purpose of the tray is to go ahead and then put air back over to the power supply. If I remember correctly, so this goes there, if I remember correct. Oh, no, I lie. Maybe. Pretty sure there. Let's grab the GDMU and we'll find out. So GDMU sits there. Right? Yep. But anyway, so I use when I 3D print something like this, it's big and flat, I use a brim just to kind of promote adhesion. And that's what you see here around the edge. And so you can just, most of the time it comes off, but this was so thin because I was having some bed leveling issues that it's so thin, it's like thinner than paper, so it just has to be cut off. And so a nice sharp X-Acto knife does the trick. And you can kind of hear the noise I'm making as I scrape across. Like, so you can see like this just pops off without an issue, but not all of it does. So you grab your X-Acto knife or some kind of razor blade and you can go ahead, you can pull it off. So alright, so you can see that's in there. So all we got to do is there's a screw here in the back that goes ahead and holds it down, and then the GDMU sits on top of it, and then it holds it in place. So we'll go ahead and we'll screw this in.
5 minutes later.
There we go. So, gotta be careful how you have things sit. Alright, so that's in. Now we can go ahead and we can put the GDMU in place. There we go. Okay. Yeah, now, it's interesting because, like, getting the SD card in and out is kind of a pain. This is, like, one of the first trays that I saw. They actually make trays where you can go ahead and have the SD card stick out and use an extender. I might think about that in the future. For the time being, that'll be good enough because I can get the SD card in and out. So, no big deal. Alright. Alright, so I messed up. The Dreamcast fan, the OE fan, uses a 5-volt fan, and I thought I bought a 5-volt Noctua fan, but apparently I bought a 12-volt Noctua fan. So I have to wait until I get a 5-volt fan to go ahead and put in, but at least I know it's going to work. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to keep working on some other stuff, and that's going to start with the power supply and removing that 12-volt rail. So I'm going to go ahead and start working on getting this thing apart, and, you know, we'll do our thing. There we go. Alright, so we have the power supply out of the Dreamcast. This thing's actually pretty simplistic, but pretty heavy duty considering, but I guess that's what you get when you go ahead and you base things off arcade hardware. There are plenty of diagrams to figure out what you need to do here to remove the 12-volt rail, but because I'm not stupid, and neither are you, and we can read, you could easily just go ahead and figure out where the 12-volt line comes from when it goes into the board. And then from there, go ahead and remove that voltage regulator. And so I'll put a picture up here in a second, but it's labeled where the pins come in from the main board, 12 volt, and I can follow that line, okay, to what's labeled the emitter of the voltage regulator. So that's this guy right here. So I can go ahead and I can remove him. But what's interesting, and again I'll show you another picture, is that there's a surface mount resistor that is soldered between the base and the collector of this voltage regulator. But what I don't understand is that they both go to ground. Yeah, they both go to a capacitor. One goes to a capacitor. One goes to a resistor. No, they're both, yeah, I don't know. But I don't see a reason to remove that. I don't think it really matters, especially because there's nothing going to be in there. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm just going to just leave that be, especially if I want to go ahead and I want to put this voltage regulator back in if I ever do anything with 12 volt again. Bring the Dreamcast back over. We can go ahead and we can plug it back in. Okay. Now, I'm screwing back into plastic. It's very easy, especially for old stuff, to go ahead and strip threads. So what I suggest is I'm turning this to the left, and you're going to eventually hear a click. I'll need you for now. Eventually hear a click. There it was. And what happens is it resets into the correct place in the thread, so you can go ahead and screw it back down without having to worry about screwing anything up. Now, honestly, everyone's like, well, you just cross-thread it, it's not a big deal, it's plastic. The problem is it's old, and the fire retardant that's in these, not only does it make stuff yellow, as you've seen, but it also, not that this is really yellowed, but it also goes ahead and makes things brittle. Now, come on. There we go. Now you can tell if you're in the right spot, because when you go screw it back in, it is really easy to screw in. If it's not easy to screw in, you probably did something wrong. So, alright, next thing, we're going to go ahead and we're going to do to our battery. So we are going to need to desolder again, but we'll get there. So looking at this, and I'll flip this so you can see it better. We get 1, 2, 3, 4 screws for the controller ports. I'm assuming that also holds the board down. There's this ribbon cable. We'll just go ahead, we'll pull that out. We'll disconnect the fan, you know, and then we'll go ahead and we'll go from there. So.
Get ready.
Alright, so this is out. This is going to actually be pretty easy. So we're going to desolder our battery. We're going to just desolder the whole thing, okay, right from there, and put our holder in. And then this little guy right here, okay, he's blue, so he sticks out pretty well. We're going to go ahead, not the capacitor, this guy here, that's our fuse. So we're going to go ahead and remove that, and then we'll put our resettable fuse in place. And then this thing's good to go. Everything looks good. Fuse is in. New battery's in. We can go ahead, we can replace that with the new one. Just like that. Double check I have the right one in here. Yep, ML, so we're good. Rechargeable. Just like that, we're in. Alright, now we can go ahead, we can put this back together. Alright, before we go any further, we want to go ahead and we want to plug this thing in and make sure we get some signs of life. Now, what we're looking for when we first plug it in, obviously, is the power LED goes on. From there, you'll notice I have a controller hooked up because this controller has a VMU with a dead cell battery, so it should beep, which will tell us that, number one, we're getting power, and we should also be able to just diagnose that it's getting data back and forth through the Maple bus, so I didn't screw up this cable. Last but not least, we're making sure the fan turns on, because if the fan doesn't turn on, that means that there's a problem. As long as all that happens, we should be good to go, and we should be able to set up the SD card and play some games. So, fingers crossed. Let's hope we don't get any magic smoke. Okay, good sign. Beep, LED, fan. Power supply looks solid. Now, I'm not getting any LED access out of my GDMU, but that might be because I don't have an SD card plugged in. Not a big deal. But so far, I think we're in an okay spot. So I guess we'll go ahead and we'll put everything apart, wrap it up, and we'll set up the SD card. All right, so we moved over to my PC so we could go ahead and get the SD card set up for the GDMU. Now, the SD card I picked, it's nothing more than a SanDisk Ultra card. It's one of the 80 megabyte a second Class 10 SD cards. Honestly, it's probably overkill as far as speed is concerned for the actual application. But size-wise, I went with a 64 gigabyte card, but I'm pretty sure the GDMU supports all the way up to 256 gigabyte cards. I didn't go with a bigger card because I didn't want to just go ahead and find a whole NA collection and dump it on and say, here, I'm done. Because I probably at that point was going to sit around and wonder what game I wanted to play more than actually play a game itself. And that's just from experience. I did that with my Bar Top Arcade, which is in my classroom. And, honestly, whatever you want to do is entirely up to you. But for me, I went with this because I can only fit approximately 60 games on it. Because the SD card, they really only format these, the 64 gig card, only really formats to 60 gigabytes. And each GDMU is a max of like 1.1 gigs. And they're not all even close. Like Crazy Taxi, for example, I think is only about 500 megabytes. But with all that said, I went with this, and I think this is probably your best bang for your buck. I bought this on Amazon cheap, and I'll link you in the description. It was like $13 for this, and I was really happy to sit there and actually have to think about what games I wanted to play. And honestly, some of them I own. Like I talked about Skies of Arcadia, I have Crazy Taxi, so on and so forth. So then there's some others that I would like to play, and and then I just have to be selective, which is great. If I want more games, I get another SD card, or I just go ahead and just change this card. It doesn't really matter. Now, why am I here? And it's not because the picking of the SD card and everything else is difficult. It's the fact that I have a 64 gigabyte SD card, because when you go ahead and you plug this thing in, all right, so I'll go ahead and I'll plug this in. You'll notice that by default, its file system is exFAT. exFAT is nothing more than extended FAT32, and it's for large file types and large disks. The GDMU, from what I've read and what I've heard and seen, whatever, only supports FAT32 officially. Now, unofficially, some people have said, hey, your mileage will vary if it's not. But honestly, I was like, okay, I'm going to go FAT32 and just roll with it. And honestly, I thought that would be easy, and then come to realize that anything that's larger than, I believe, 32 gigabytes on Windows 10, Windows 8, Windows 7 won't, by default, let you format it to FAT32. Now, in order for us to actually format this thing to FAT32, I needed some kind of tool, and that's why you've seen this Ease US website up on the screen. No, it's not an ad. No, it's not a paid sponsorship. It's actually the opposite. To find the free version of the software was a giant pain in my ass, so I'm going to link it to you, because if you Google it yourself, the first 4 links are going to give you the trial edition, which doesn't let you do anything. It's idiotic. They just want you to pay them money. So the free version, is free, but I'm going to be completely honest. You load it up and 2 ads pop up right away. I'm sure they're selling your data. It kind of is what it is. You're not going to use it that long. But I already have it open. You saw it's on my desktop. Download it, install it. Boom, it's there. And you go ahead and you open it. Once the ads go away, which is why I opened it already, you'll see here you get all your different discs. Now, I'm going to make the assumption you know the difference between the disc that you plugged in, the SD card, versus something like your main boot drive or any other extra storage you have. So this is my boot drive, disk 0. This is all my other data on 2 Western Digital Blackstone RAID 0 configuration. And then F right here is my SD card. If you don't know what that is, you're scaring me. And I take no responsibility if you format something the wrong way. With all that said, you'll notice, okay, for file system, I'm not sure why it says other. We know it's exFAT, but we want to make this thing FAT32. And it's actually pretty easy. If I just go ahead and I right-click this, you'll see that the window pops up, or a menu, and I can click Format. And you'll notice here, file system FAT32 is the first option. If not, you click that, change it to FAT32. I'm going to change this to 16 kilobyte for cluster size because of the nature of the GDMU and the data that's there. That's just what I've read. I don't really know if it matters as far as read speeds are concerned, but I'm going to roll with it, and then I'm going to label it GDMU so I know that's what it is. You can label it whatever you want, doesn't really matter. Format it to FAT32, click OK. Yes, it's going to erase. And then from there, it's going to say, oh, do you want to execute? So in case you screw up, you don't have to do this. But I'm right, so I'm going to click execute. Yes, please apply. And pretty much like that, it's going to be done. And then we're going to go ahead and we're going to use the GDMU SD card maker software. Now, again, you can actually set up any SD card in any file system format the correct way, and the GDMU, my understanding, might actually try to make sense of it and make it work. but the GDMU SD card maker software will only show your drive if it's FAT32, so that's why I'm doing this. Now that this is all done, I can close this, and when I'm done this video, I'm probably uninstalling this. But from there, we need the SD card maker software, and to be honest, it's kind of a pain to find, so I'll link that down in the description as well. And I found it on GitHub, and I'll go ahead and I'll just link you to Escorted's whole Dreamcast tools library, because he's got some interesting stuff here. But if you go to Unsorted, and then from down here you find it's like GDMUSD, it's this thing here. You can download this. Again, links in the description. You download it. It's not an executable file. It's something that has to be unpackaged. I use 7-zip. You might just use the built-in thing with Windows. Whatever you use, you can scan it with a virus scan software if you're a little scared. I did. Nothing came up, and that's should be good to go. So that's on my desktop. I'm going to go ahead and open that up. First time, it's going to ask you, hey, what language do you speak? And you're going to go ahead and select whatever language you did. For me, it's English. And then from there, this pops up. Now, for drive, you click this. You'll notice the only thing I have is F, because that's the only thing that's formatted to FAT32. If you have nothing there, you either didn't successfully format your card's not inserted, or you've got a problem with whatever reader that you're using. I'm assuming you have some kind of SD card reader or some kind of hub like I do, but if not, make sure you buy one when you pick up an SD card when you do this. But so F's there. Other things you might want to think about, you'll notice that I have menu checked. By default, menu is not checked. There is a built-in menu that will automatically install into what's called index 0 or folder 0, and that's the first thing that'll boot from the SD card with the GDMU. If you don't put the menu in there, whatever the first game you throw in there is going to be the game that boots, and you're going to be frustrated when it's always that game. So the menu is great because it just goes to the menu, and then you can select whatever game you want. The only reason I could see why you wouldn't want to put the menu in there is if you're going to use individual 1 gigabyte SD cards and almost treat it like it's the Switch, which actually would be kind of pretty cool if you went ahead and had your own jewel cases, but it's not what I want to do. So the menu selected, and then from there I can go ahead and I can either hit the plus sign, or you can just drag and drop stuff in, which is what I'm going to do. I have Crazy Taxi on my desktop. Crazy Taxi is a game I own, so I don't feel so bad showing you that because it's just my personal copy. So I'm just going to drag and drop this in here. This will show you, okay, it's game number 1. Again, because the menu is game number 0, and that will show up, I think, once you save this and then you pull it out and put it back in. Doesn't matter. But from there, that's as easy as that. Now, some of the other options, okay, you see under the patch frame here, you have VGA and region. And so the VGA patch is great because if you've got a game that doesn't support VGA, it'll go ahead and patch it. Now, Crazy Taxi by default actually supports VGA because the Naomi could do both VGA output and then also standard 240p, which is just your standard resolution arcade monitor if they were refitting into old cabs. So that doesn't need it. But if I were to go and put something like NFL Blitz 2000, which doesn't support VGA, that'll go ahead and patch it. And I'm pretty sure the reason it doesn't support VGA is I think that NFL Blitz is actually a medium resolution game, if I remember correctly. The NFL Blitz in general is a strange arcade game because in my understanding it's an optical joystick. It's not even like a 4 or 8-way joystick. It's an optical joystick. They wanted to make it analog. So they did all sorts of weird things with that cabinet. Don't get me wrong, I would love to own one, but the Dreamcast game is just going to have to be good enough. So if you select VGA, it'll patch every game that you actually go ahead and load into the SD card in that session and patch it. I haven't heard or read anything where if you patch a game that's already VGA enabled that it'll create any issues, but your mileage may vary. Just make sure you understand that. The other one's region. I think that's pretty self-explanatory, but obviously if you have a game that's not for your region Dreamcast, I have an NA console. If I were to put in something like the Japanese GDI, I'd need to patch it so it would actually run on my console. Again, I don't have any of them right now, so I don't need to use it, but if you do, you're going to have to select that and then patch that GDI or CDI before you put it onto the GDMU itself. Once you get all that figured out, you go ahead, you click Save. Do you want to customize your menu? And I'm not going to lie, I haven't even looked into this. I might at some point, but for the time being, I'm not going to. So I'm going to click no. You're more than welcome to figure that out on your own and Google it. Anyway, from here, you'll notice just going through, and I'm not going to lie, I've actually gone through and done this, so I knew what I was talking about. But I went and did it was maybe 25 or 30 games, and it feels like it's almost about a minute a game. I think I walked away, made lunch, came back, and it was done. So when you do this, depending on how many games you do, it's going to take some time. Just be aware. Probably that 1-to-1's a good estimate, even though Crazy Taxi is taking less time than that. Crazy Taxi is also only a 500 megabyte game. It's not a full gigabit. A gigabyte game is not a full GDI. So that's basically what's going on. But once it goes through, it says it's done. And then you can go ahead. You can pull the card out. And there it is. So you're ready to go. So now we're done. Let's plug this thing into the Dreamcast and play some games. All right, so we're back over at the gaming hub. I have my SD card set up and ready to go, and we're going to give this a test. Now, I'm not going to lie, I actually went ahead and I did this off camera just to make sure everything worked before I went ahead and I hit the record button. But the one thing I can tell you is that I'm actually not happy just with the stock GDMU setup. To get the card in and out of the reader is relatively cumbersome, and it's something that I didn't think I would really even think about or care about, because I was only going to just take the card and only have to pull it in and out when I wanted to change games, change SD cards, which wouldn't happen often, as I kind of described why I went with the 64 gig card to begin with. But with that said, I did see that some people made some designs for trays that incorporated an SD card extender, and now I'm kind of second guessing myself, hey, maybe you should have done that. Honestly, I just got the fan, the appropriate fan, so I'm going to have to pull this thing apart anyway to go ahead and do that mod, and it'll be another video, so maybe I'll go ahead and bite the bullet, and I'll just decide, hey, I'm going to upgrade the SD card slot while I'm at it. Alright, so without further delay, I know I've talked a lot this video. Let's go ahead and let's get the SD card plugged in, let's get my camera reorganized, and let's go ahead and let's run through and test some games and see how everything works. Alright, as you can see, we went ahead, we closed everything up, we booted the console. This is going to automatically load into the GD menu because my console was set to go automatically launch if there was a disc in the console. I'm not going to lie, I'm probably going to change that back so it goes to the Dreamcast system menu so I can just do it manually, because in order to go ahead and access the menu, it's actually a little cumbersome. I either have to A, go ahead and pull the SD card out, reset the console, or B, hope that when I use the exit feature on the menu that it actually does what it's supposed to do, because I've had it actually launch whatever game is highlighted at the given time, which is a little strange. That said, the GD menu is relatively simplistic, but I do like it. You'll notice that I have more games here that I had on my video, and that was just to save time. But so I love that it shows me disc art, although I don't necessarily know it dictates where it gets the disc art, because Crazy Taxi, that might be the actual disc, but if I go to Power Stone 2, it's upside down. And then Power Stone is the Japanese disc. So I'm going to look into that, because I think I'd rather actually have the jewel case art rather than the actual disc. But that's another time, maybe another video. But this is really simple. I can go ahead and just select my game. There is a menu if you hit X, and so it does give you some other odds and ends. I'm not going to go into that and let you do that on your own. But literally all I do is I hit A. It launches the game like I went ahead and I inserted a disc. Now it does go through this again, and I actually did look to see if I could stop it from doing this, but I can't. It's just based off the BIOS and the data that it reads off of the GD-ROM. Alright, so that's basically it. I hope you enjoyed my video. I don't think the GDMU setup was really all that complicated at all. Honestly, if you were to go ahead and incorporate a Pico power supply and just remove the original power supply, you wouldn't have to do any of the 12-volt rail removal like I did. I'm not going to lie, the more research I do, it looks like, for all intents and purposes, the 12-volt rail doesn't create as much heat as everyone thinks it does. And for those of you that still want to go ahead and use some of those And for those of you that want to actually go ahead and use some of the accessories that uses the 12-volt rail, I don't like it. All right, so that about wraps up this video. Thank you so much for dropping by. I think the GDMU is actually a relatively simplistic setup, but it does require a little bit of effort on you as the end user to go ahead and, I guess, put the fit and finish on that you may want. I'm not going to lie, like, if you aren't comfortable removing the 12-volt rail, the more research I do, it seems like everyone's split that really matters. I pulled mine out and I didn't do any tests, but the temperatures definitely don't seem to get hot like people go ahead and say they do. But if you want to go ahead and use some of those accessories that use the 12-volt rail, like the broadband adapter, or you want to go ahead and you want to use the actual modem because you're using something like a DreamPod, then you're going to have to keep the 12-volt rail there, and maybe you decide to go with a Pico power supply instead, although there's some people split on if that's a good idea or not. But other than that, like I said, thank you so much for dropping by. Again, this was not supposed to be a full-fledged do-it-yourself. It was just basically to say, hey, this is what's going on, so you can see it. If you have any questions, please go ahead, drop them down in the comments. I'll do my best to answer them, or at least give you some direction in order to find an answer. But until next time, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to play some Dreamcast. I'll see you guys later.